Story time with Mr. Beat.
Who's thirsty? My name is Mr. Beat. One thing is for sure. Throughout history, Americans of legal age have really liked their alcohol, which makes what I'm going to be talking about in this video even more extraordinary. Here's the story of the time the United States federal government made it illegal to make, sell, or transport alcoholic beverages, otherwise known as Prohibition.
Once upon a time, people drank a lot of alcohol. I mean, seriously, a lot more than they do today. When the Pilgrims came over on the Mayflower, they carried more beer on the ship than water. The first Americans drank alcohol with every meal and often on the job. In fact, in 1790, most Americans consumed an average of 5.8 gallons of pure alcohol a year. By 1830, it was 7.1 gallons a year. That's the equivalent of over 35 bottles of wine a year. Oh yeah, and there was no national drinking age. By this time, a growing number of Americans became deeply troubled about the negative effects of alcohol on society. Many men everywhere seemed to be drunk all the time. These men were abusive or drank so much they lost their jobs with no safety net to protect their families. Several women used Protestant churches as a way to organize protests. Then there was the nativism, or fear of foreigners, aspect. Many Americans living in rural areas freaked out about the rising number of immigrants moving to cities. They associated crime with immigrants and, of course, drinking. By the end of the 1800s, the United States was in a widespread series of reforms and social activism that later became known as the Progressive Era. A big part of this era was an increased call to make alcohol illegal. Leading the way was Wayne Wheeler of the Anti-Saloon League, an extremely influential lobbyist who helped Prohibition become a hot-button issue, one that seemingly everyone was now talking about. By 1913, half the country was under some form of alcohol prohibition. After the United States entered World War I in 1917, however, Prohibition wasn't talked about as much anymore. No surprise. Still, by that time, the dries outnumbered the wets in Congress. I probably should back up a little bit here. The dries were the folks who wanted Prohibition, and the wets, no, they didn't wet the bed like you were thinking. They were the ones against Prohibition. German Americans were a strong group against Prohibition, but since the United States had declared war on, Germany, this group was now marginalized. Prohibition also gained steam when people realized that getting rid of the production of alcohol would free up more resources for the war effort. In order for Prohibition to exist at the national level, the Constitution had to be amended. In December 1917, both houses of Congress voted for this. By January of 1919, a couple months after World War I ended, 36 of the 48 states had ratified the 18th Amendment, which made the production, sale, and shipment of alcohol illegal. It did allow consumption or private possession of alcohol, interestingly enough. To enforce it, Congress passed the Volstead Act, named after the very dry Representative Andrew Volstead. But as we will soon see, actually enforcing Prohibition was not going to be easy. Prohibition went into effect on January 16, 1920, and immediately everyone in the country stopped drinking and absolutely followed the law, like they always do. I joke. Seriously though, drinking did go down now that it was more difficult, but it most definitely still occurred. It just now occurred underground, in the black market. Bootlegging, or the illegal production and sale of liquor, began on, you guessed it, January 16, 1920. Law-abiding citizens now became outlaws. One great example of this is Roy Olmsted, a very successful bootlegger in the Pacific Northwest region. A former lieutenant in the Seattle Police Department, he lost his job after it was discovered he was illegally importing alcohol from Canada. After he was fired, he actually expanded his bootlegging operations. People began making their own alcohol in their own homes. People called it moonshine or bathtub gin. This alcohol usually tasted bad and sometimes could kill people who drank it. Illegal drinking spots named Speakeasies, which existed before Prohibition, now increasingly sprung up. Even though the Bureau of Prohibition raided them regularly, new ones would immediately open up because they made so much money. These speakeasies became a huge part of American culture during the 1920s, even making jazz music more popular. One big change thanks to speakeasies was integration, or the bringing together of different groups. People of all skin colors drank together and even mingled. Prohibition caused the rise of criminal activity associated with bootlegging and speakeasies. Gangsters like Chicago-based Al Capone became notorious for earning millions from the black market and often resorting to violence to gain market advantage. In 1929, Capone's men allegedly dressed up as policemen and killed members of a rival gang, which became known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. This is just one example of how Prohibition caused violent crime to increase and become more organized than ever before. There were actually perfectly legal ways to get around Prohibition if you wanted to drink. For example, doctors regularly prescribed whiskey to patients in pain. You could still produce up to 200 gallons of wine for personal use every year. Some wineries stayed open during Prohibition due to the increased demand for sacramental wine for Roman Catholic services, who seem to strangely need more of it now. Again, plenty of people were breaking the law, and there weren't enough federal Prohibition agents to enforce it. Several of the police, realizing the law was hard to enforce or disagreeing with the law, became corrupt, accepting bribes and turning their head the other way, or even participating in breaking the law themselves. Even with spotty enforcement, the court systems were clogged and the prisons became overcrowded. Law enforcement officials became so desperate that they actually ordered the poisoning of industrial alcohol produced. They were trying to scare people and prevent them from drinking illegally, but ultimately ended up killing thousands of people in the process. By the end of the 1920s, most Americans did not support Prohibition. Even those who formerly passionately supported Prohibition no longer did. The stock market crash of 1929 and the worst economic downturn in the history of the Western industrialized world, the Great Depression, followed. The country was struggling, and at this time, taxing alcohol looked like a way to increase shrinking revenue. By the time Franklin Roosevelt became president in 1933, the repeal movement was stronger than ever. On March 22, 1933, Roosevelt signed an amendment to the Volstead Act that allowed the manufacture and sale of 3.2% beer and light wines. After signing the law, known as the Cullen-Harrison Act, Roosevelt said, quote, "I think this would be a good time for a beer," unquote. While some states, counties, and cities still enforce some form of prohibition as late as 1966, at the federal level, prohibition officially ended with ratification of the 21st Amendment on December 5, 1933. Known as a, quote, noble experiment, prohibition attempted to solve society's problems caused by alcohol consumption. In the end, it only made things worse. By nearly all accounts, it was a miserable failure. It continues to serve as a lesson today that sometimes the best intentions have horrible unintended consequences. With the current war on drugs, which many people say is also ineffective, the lessons of prohibition are perhaps more relevant today than ever before. The end.